Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Faith and Ecocide Law. This is part of a very varied programme of events that Stop Ecocide International are hosting over these 2 weeks here in Glasgow at COP26. And today, our theme has been about the sacred already this morning, where we had an event with incredible Indigenous leaders who talked about the bridge that this law can create between the sacred and the necessary. And that feels like a nice place to start. But before we dive in, we have a musical provocation today from Eve Pearson Maxwell, who will be coming to sing for us in a moment. She's a 19-year-old soprano from Argyll on the west coast of Scotland. She's in her second year studying vocal performance with Elizabeth McCormack at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. In 2018, Eve was selected by her local Rotary Club to compete in the Rotary Young Musician of the Year competition. She represented Scotland and the northeast of England in the final and placed first runner-up. Following this, she was asked to perform at the Auchterarder Rotary Club charity concert in 2019 to sing as their headline act. In 2021, Eve was awarded with the Winnie Busfield Award by the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland for both musical ability and good voice. In November of 2021, she competed in the Kathleen Ferrier Young Singers, representing the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Eve.
Una vieja Valenciana y una muchacha dos cuartos. Una vieja Valenciana y una muchacha dos cuartos. Pero como soy tan pobre, me voy a lo más barato. Pero como soy tan pobre, me voy a lo más barato. Con el vito, 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 con el vito, vito va. Con el vito, 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 con el vito, vito va. No me haga usted cosquillas, que me pongo colora. No me haga usted cosquillas, que me pongo colora.
Thank you so much. What a lovely way to start. I'm happy for this. I'm Henrik Grape from World Council of Churches, but also representing Church of Sweden, because we have been in a partnership with Ecocide Sweden, working on to gather faith leaders from around the world on to go on ecocide. So we have done some webinars in this time. Should I use this one maybe? Because it sounds like we have some feedback all the time. I think this works better. Is fine? Thank you. I think that we over the years have had a dialogue with Stop Ecocide Sweden and found out, yes, there is much we can do from a faith perspective, and we know the importance that faiths play all over the world when it comes to protecting the vulnerable, and when it comes to protect the ecosystem. Faith could step forward and do something much more on this. So we have gathered people actually from all around the world to come behind a kind of manifesto for faith for Ecocide Law. But to help us more with the Ecocide Law deal, I want Jojo to help us to describe, especially people from faith may not have all the facts, so help us with that if you want to, please.
Thank you. So I'll give a brief introduction to the law and what we're working towards. So I co-founded Stop Ecocide International with Scottish barrister and legal pioneer Polly Higgins, my dear departed close colleague and friend, and it feels very special to be talking about Ecocide here in Glasgow because it was actually her birthplace. So I'd like to honour that. She spent the last 10 years of her life, and our campaign globally now, in a very fast-growing manner, is dedicated to criminalising serious harm to nature at the international level. In other words, adding ecocide to the list of existing international crimes, which are currently genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. The International Criminal Court deals with the crimes that are considered to be of most serious concern for the international community as a whole. And we believe that ecocide, or mass destruction of ecosystems, absolutely belongs in that category. We aim for that particular route, in other words, the international crime route, for a number of reasons. And the first very practical legal one is that the International Criminal Court, of which the Rome Statute is the governing document, is the only global mechanism which directly accesses, or sort of taps into, if you like, the criminal justice systems of its member states directly. So if a member state ratifies a crime at the International Criminal Court, it will also have to include it in its own national legislation. Given the urgency and the stark reality of the crisis that we're now facing on the planet, both climate and ecological crisis, it seems highly reasonable to aim for something that can access many jurisdictions at once, also because the worst polluters tend to be transnational corporations who can operate in more than one jurisdiction. The second reason is that this situation that we're in, it's very much a global one. There may be many global inequalities and many global differences, but when it comes to this situation that humanity's never faced before, where we're facing not just the extinction of many, many thousands of species and increasing numbers, but our own species also being at threat, we can't just point over there to a particular company or a particular country and say, that leak, it's at your end of the boat. If the boat goes down, we all go down. So aiming for something at the international level acknowledges that and also enables governments to be able to see it coming, to be able to support at the international level. It can be quite scary for governments to legislate overnight for something like this, and actually it could be quite chaotic if that happened. But ultimately the aim is to get everybody on board. There are already 16 member states of the International Criminal Court talking about this at parliamentary or government level. And to do so shows incredible climate leadership, and it also allows for that momentum to grow so that when this crime is ultimately agreed upon, which we estimate could take 4, maybe 5 years, but probably not longer than that actually in both the political and the literal climate that we're in. When it comes to that point, those governments will know that they feel safe in numbers, that they can all move forward together. And of course that will also be more effective. And the third reason, which is perhaps the sort of underlying reason in a way, and longer term, perhaps the most important, is that by criminalizing serious harm to the natural living world, we're acknowledging the seriousness of that damage, and we're actually starting to rebalance the mindset that has been very heavily anthropocentric, and law has been very much about protecting people, and sometimes even more so about protecting property. But the environment and the natural world around us, of which we're actually a part and on which we completely depend, that body of law is not taken as seriously. And corporations will happily pay a fine or get a slap on the wrist. And perhaps they suffer in their public image if they're brought to court. But there's no real enforceable deterrent around that currently. And so to do that, to place ecocide alongside genocide, is a very, very strong message. It's basically saying that damage to nature is as serious as damage to human beings. And while the intent may be in a different scale, people rarely set out deliberately to destroy the environment. They set out to make money, or they set out to grow food, or they set out to do these other things. Unlike genocide, which is actually defined by wanting to destroy a part of a people, ecocide isn't like that, but the consequences are as deadly, if not more so, in terms of the scope of the potential consequences of continued destruction of our natural world. And so it does very much belong in that category of serious crime. And this enables us to perhaps realize the equal importance of thinking about protecting the natural world and beginning to sort of unify those what have been disconnected for so long in terms of those concepts. I hope that gives an overview that's useful, and I'll hand back to Henrik to carry on hosting.
Thank you so much. I hope that we will come into dialogue after we have our first round. I would like to give the floor to Alexandra from Soka Gakkai. We have been working together in the Interfaith Liaison Committee to the UNFCCC over the years. She is based in Geneva, and you are very much on the human rights agenda. One good thing with the pandemic, we actually learned to know each other better over the screen that we have done over the 10 days at COP. We actually have done so much more together, so there are some good outcome of this as well. And one is also that to be truly interfaith, I mean, we are three Christian old grumpy men at this panel, so and more or less gray-haired, I'm most. It should be a better representation. But I'm happy to have you, Alexandra, here, not just because you're a woman, because you're one of the more clever ones among us. So please come with your first thinking.
Thank you, Henrik. I'm very happy and honored to be here. Thank you, Jojo, for the great overview and that link that's just so direct to, I think, what is very common to our different faith. And so I am a Buddhist, an SGI Buddhist, and when I was really going deeper into what is ecocide law and what it's calling for, I reflected on several points in where I feel really relates to Buddhism and to my, in a way, the way I see my Buddhist practice, and then the way I see it engage with human rights, with the rights of nature in a way. And I think 3 points really came out very clearly for me. And the first one I feel is, so based on Buddhist philosophy, the call for such a legal and ethical tool as an ecocide law really relates directly to the transformation of our relationship with nature. So I feel it's going to be really very instrumental in grounding this absolute need that we have to transform our relationship with nature. From the Buddhist perspective, we are interconnected. Buddhist philosophy teaches about dependent origination, which means that we are everything, be it social, natural phenomenon, depend on something else. So we all rely on each other and on the various ecosystems. So there is this deep interconnectedness that is, at the heart of our relationship with nature, the environment, and others. And there is a concept also from the Japanese word. It's called Eisho Funi, and it means, so it's the teaching about the oneness of self and environment. And so it means that although on the surface environment and self seems to be separate, eisho, so environment and self. Fu-ni means two but not two. So at the deeper level, we are one and the same. So that's, from the Buddhist philosophy and perspective, there is this deep ethical and philosophical concept that completely is the echoes what Faith for Ecocide Law is trying to really achieve. So that's really one thing. And of course, from the human rights perspective, in a way, if we cannot have our right to water, to food, to respected, yes, as humanity, we also just cannot survive. So this respect for the dignity of life, to take concrete action to also make it able to continue. And the second point is, I feel, really relates to it's really a good tool also to enable a deep change of narrative in this need for the transformation of our inner self. So in Buddhism, we have this idea of the three poisons, greed, anger, and ignorance, that are really the source of many ills that we see in our relationship to ourselves, to others, to nature. And then at the society level, no, it's like extreme profit seeking, really power relationship that just erase communities, that erase places, lands. So as Buddhists, it's really central to the practice to be able to really transform ourselves and these tendencies. And ultimately, Ecocide Law, I feel, can enable also this change of narrative deeply to enable the personal transformation has to happen at the personal level, but it's a great tool to really bring it to a level of collective transformation. And so in Buddhism, yes, there is this the ideal of the Bodhisattva, who's really an ideal of humane behavior, and that's grounded on compassion. And so it's the practice of expanding, always expanding our spheres of compassion, in also a very, I would say, fighting way, to really fight some tendencies inside ourselves. So to expand this compassion, fighting the tendencies inside ourselves, and then taking really action towards others, families, the land, the community. And so we call that also in some ways, we also in the SGI we call that the process of human revolution. So I think Ecocide Law, in a way, it's like also bringing this narrative at this collective level, and I think it's very directly linked to Buddhist philosophy. And the third point, and the last point, I think it relates to this idea of intergenerational justice, equity, and from the Buddhist perspective, there is this idea that life is eternal, and so with this practice of really trying to respect the dignity of our own life, but also the life of those to come, humans and non-humans, really all lives. So from that perspective of intergenerational justice, equity, it relates very much. And so maybe to not take too much time, but I still would like to quote a quote from SGI President Daisaku Ikeda, which I think is really beautiful. And he says, life is a chain. All things are related. When any link is harmed, the other links are affected. We should think of the environment as our mother. There is no crime worse than harming one's mother. Yes, so I'm going to conclude on that quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Very happy for this. I think we will come back and we will dialogue on this, but I will give the word to Fletcher Harper from Green Faith. You have been along for some time doing interfaith work on climate change and divestment and investment. And and working for a grassroots level action to action on climate change. But you represent one Christianity. I'm coming from the USA. I mean, you are the crooks, or we are the crooks, and somehow. So, what is your perspective on the Ecocide Law and the law for ecocide from I mean, both from your faith, but also from the interfaith dialogue you've been into?
It's nice to be on a panel with you, Henrik. First, I'm an old, cranky man with gray hair, and now I'm a crook. It can't get much worse. Do I get arrested at the end of the... No, it's good to be here. So from my perspective, at least from a Christian perspective, we've got the law, which is, and we've got 10 commandments. And the 10 commandments don't say, try really hard not to kill. They say, don't kill, so on and so on. And I think that, I thought, Jojo, that you were very articulate and even understated the urgency of the situation. I mean, what we've got going on is the planet getting incinerated and destroyed in every way imaginable, and no safeguard in place with real teeth to stop that. So I think that one of the things to me that is so important about an ecocide law is that it is a strong step towards saying, cut out this voluntary compliance will get us where we need to go, and set a limit. I mean, if you saw a member of your family about to get killed, you wouldn't say, let's go into a voluntary compliance regime here, right? I mean, the ludicrousness of the approach and the idea that we should trust a market-based system to put limits on itself is so insane that it's a negative commentary on us that we're still sitting here having to justify this approach. I mean, let's be real about this. We're in the grips of multinational corporations, either corrupt or ineffective governments or complicit governments that don't want to solve the problem. That's the reality. I mean, we're living in the middle of that. Thank God there, is enough of a civil society sort of community here at COP. Otherwise, I think we'd all go insane dealing with what's going on here. I mean, it is real. I think that we need to be ready to sort of reckon with this on that kind of level. So the first thing is you need a law. You need a hard stop. And you need, and now I'm going to go sort of, in what Christians would call, I'm going to go sort of, full scale Old Testament sort of thing. I mean, you need the threat of punishment. I mean, let's be real. And this is, I think, where it's fun to have some real differences because, it's always been one of the real differences, I think, between a Buddhist and Dharmic perspective and an Abrahamic perspective is that the Dharmic community, I think probably wisely in the long term, says stay away from anger, whereas the Abrahamic community can't resist the temptation. And so, but my feeling is you've got to have, look, you need carrots and you need sticks, period. End of sentence. Every young child needs, you try to raise a child without some sort of, not physical, but without some sort of limit. It's impossible. You get a monster. That's what we've got now. There need to be limits. There needs to be the threat of punishment. And I think that progressive Christianity, because there was so much lousy Christian teaching and history for so many centuries, progressive Christians have started to have sort of lost an ability to say there have to be limits. And there is, we believe, that ultimately God is a God of justice. And that God will bring justice. And that means that the meek will be lifted up and those who've been abused and dispossessed. And it means the powerful who destroy life will be brought low. And I think that, again, that to me, obviously I'm digging much more in on the sort of the moral emotion basis for a law like this. But let's not kid ourselves. We are moral emotional animals before we are moral rational animals. And so I think that this is one of the things that faith communities in certain parts of the world have to bring into the mix. We have to get the culture shifted so that there's a willingness to draw these hard lines. Now, there are also, there are lots of points of connection, the dependent arising. The Bible is full of teachings that make the New Testament about the body of Christ representing the entire created order. The least helpful from an ecological perspective. Teachings that the way they're interpreted from the Bible say that at the end of time when Christ comes again, that God's going to push the incineration button and all of the Christians get medevaced away from the planet and the rest of the thing just gets blown up. I mean, talk about an ugly set of teachings, and it's not biblical, but that's the common understanding of it. But I think that, we have to, what the Bible says is that the salvation that God brings into reality involves people and planet and the entire effing universe. So let's start to shape our culture's core laws and rules to focus on that. And let's have this debate in a highly visible, highly public way. One of the best things, and I'll speak now from a U.S. perspective, that the Ecocide Law debate has going for it, is that in many places it's so highly implausible that it's a great conversation starter. It's a great tool for cultural engagement, which is going to be necessary and a precondition to getting the legal structures in place. So I think one of the things we think about in relationship to this is, how do you use this at the parliamentary level, at that sort of official level, but how do you build the grassroots cultural support that's going to be necessary to get these kinds of changes over the finish line? And in that regard, I think that, religious communities can be a big, big help and can help sort of put the question to society and frankly to some of the ferociously reactionary and destructive religious voices that will oppose this. Many of them Christian. I mean, there will be lots of fundamentalist Christian groups around the globe that will say, oh, this is crazy, this is left-wing, blah, blah, blah. And as people of faith, we're the people who can take on those groups that have a misguided understanding of what religion really ought to be about and say, here's what our tradition believes in. You want to talk about protecting life? This is about protecting life. You want to talk about respect for the Creator? This is about respect for the Creator. You want to talk about love and compassion and justice? This is love and compassion and justice. So you get the deal. You've had wonderful, enlightened, peaceful, thoughtful, now you've had angry old man ranting. So anyway, that's what I'd say.
Thank you. It was hard.
You're welcome.
So it's hard to fall asleep when you talk, Fletcher. So
I'm so glad to know.
I guess we have to leave in different ways. So yeah, that's fine. I will now give the floor to James Bagwan. James is also. I mean, I have friends everywhere, but I have many friends on the shares there. So, but I still think you're a friend of mine, James. You are from the Pacific Conference of Churches. We have been doing some work on climate change over the years, and from our different perspective. And very often, James come with the perspective that we sort of often ignore, I would say. So I would like to hear your thoughts and take on the faith for ecocide law.
I'm glad we figured out who the cranky old man on this side of the room was before I spoke. Him, not you. Mbulavinaka, greetings everybody. I want to begin by acknowledging where we are, that we're in a land of Alba, known nowadays as Scotland, that before invasions, and maybe still in some places, there are people who are deeply connected with land and with place here. And we do that, and we acknowledge the ancestors of this place who lived in harmony with the environment. That's our way in the Pacific. We acknowledge that we are part of the land and the sea and the sky, and we acknowledge the ancestors are still alive in spirit through the land and through the sea. I'm not going to give a speech. We've had the sermon already, so let me tell a story. When my children were born, and I've actually reflected on this quite a bit. I shared some of it at the, I think at the Interfaith Talanoa Dialogue the other night, a week ago. When my children were born, as is the custom in many of our Pacific Island countries, we took what we call the pito pito, the umbilical cord. You know, that's the bit that's still left after the doctor snips, or the nurse snips, or whoever snips it when they come out. And when that dries up and falls off, that is buried in your homeland, in your village, in your community. It's buried with either a sapling, a seedling of an indigenous tree, or for many of us, just with a coconut tree. Now, that signifies that your place is with the land, that you are part of the land. And as that tree grows, so do you grow. We say those whose umbilical cords are not planted in the land, they are forever unrooted. They wander. They have no sense of place. The Maori people call it Turanga Waiwai, the place in which you stand. For Pacific people, and I'm going to use that as a kind of defining line between perhaps global north and global south, because this is a global north conversation. I'll be honest. I don't think we need carrot and stick, because I think we can still talk to the horse and the donkey in their ear and they will listen and do. We have people who call the whale and call the fish and call the vonu the turtle. We have people who continue to smell the rain and touch the land, and all that recognition that that is not just part of the indigenous community, as you would have had in the indigenous spirituality this morning, but also deeply connected for the largely Christian population of the Pacific. Because we see ourselves as part of God's household. In fact, within the ecumenical movement, the interdenominational Christian movement, we don't refer to ourselves as an ecumenical body, we refer to ourselves as the household of God in the Pacific. Now, theological lesson, perhaps the word household in Greek is oikos. And from oikos you get oikos nomos, which becomes economics, the management of the household. Oikos logos, ecology, the study of the household, the planet, the biodiversity, and oikumeni, our ecumenism, our working together. And ecumenism in that sense is more than just Christians, it is actually interfaith, all God's people. In our way, we see this as a mat, a sacred mat, different strands woven together. But we acknowledge that because of colonialism, we have this mat being ripped apart and rewoven in a very toxic way. So we're at the extractive end now, where the land is being dug up, where the ocean is being overfished and now being looked to be dug up as well in terms of deep sea mining. And we have gone through generations, just as other indigenous communities have, of being told that this way of life is not only wrong, it's stupid. When I heard about this movement for an ecocide law, I was very grateful. And that's why I've said to Henrik from the Pacific, we want to support this because it's a way to right the balance. It is still very much an anthropocentric way of doing things because we have to have a law about it, right? And we have to have some righteous fury and anger to go with it because of what is being done and what has been done. But one of the things that we need to do is not make this a conversation that is in separate spaces. So I want to encourage us that the conversation that would have happened this morning also needs to be brought into this space, because that's when you start to weave things together, when we weave communities. And in this context, we find ourselves at the end of this huge globalized monster that is coming to attack us. Again, I go back very quickly to the people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Maori people. I was listening to a conversation where they were talking about the taniwha, the monster, the water monster that came to attack the land. They were talking about a flood. And they said to the people, don't build this road here because the monster comes through this way. Stupid, ignorant natives, what do they know about monsters? They were referring to the river that forces its way through. In New Zealand, one of the rivers has been actually given the rights of a person. And for me, that's why it resonates, because we're saying the land, the ocean has rights. And for us, it is, it's astounding that it's taken so long, but we're not surprised because of how the world is. But this makes perfect sense for us. Because our home, the Blue Pacific, yes, sea levels are rising and climate change, etc. You all know those stories. But our home, the ocean, is being seen as the final frontier for profit. And that home right now provides more oxygen than anywhere else on the planet. And so we already see what has happened to the green lung of the planet. Our sisters and brothers from the morning are part of that impact of the destruction of the green lung. And for me, this is something that we need to do and needs to happen now so that we can save the blue lung of this planet. Naka, thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, Jojo, I would like to, what is your reaction from these three different perspectives that come to law and ecocide? So what do you say?
I'm just delighted to hear such clear and different perspectives, and they speak to so many different aspects of how this law interacts with so many different areas. And it really makes me realize how so much of our job in this movement is a job of translation, because the idea itself is very simple and clean and on one level very obvious. I mean, I've actually yet to meet anybody one-to-one who doesn't think this is a good idea. I've met a few skeptics who think, oh, pie in the sky will never happen. And then you tell them that 16 governments are talking about it, and that the International Corporate Governance Network, which is a network of asset managers across the world, it includes, I think, asset managers of over half the world's managed asset, like 59 trillion, who are asking the COP26 presidency to recommend governments to legislate for ecocide. And then they kind of go, oh, really? So this is, just those different elements that are popping up with this concept in so many different places. A real eye-opener to hear the corporate finance world talking about it in that way. But yeah, when I say it feels like a work of translation, there are so many ways in which this very simple concept will, it's almost surgical or acupunctural, it's so precise. Just add this crime to this list. It's really simple. It's hugely complementary to the rights of nature movement, of course, which is actually longer established in the world and has had many successes in many jurisdictions. But is talking about, the rights of nature movement is talking about a whole shift in the concept of how the legal world works, whereas ecocide law is kind of a very precise intervention. But I feel it has the potential to actually enable and move towards that broader shift. And there were a few particular things that are interesting about what's been said already. So I was, obviously, I love the way you put it, about needing to have the enforceable deterrent. And one of the ways that we often talk about ecocide law is actually precisely in those terms of a guardrail. Because, we're kind of dancing at the edge of a precipice with our current legal system. And we have a situation at the moment where corporations have their legal obligation is actually to make money for their shareholders. That is their legal obligation. And so I was totally in agreement with this thing that, you know, the goodwill and ambition and voluntary self-regulation are just never going to get us there. You know, there has to be a point at which, actually, no, it's just dangerous to go beyond that point. So really strongly related to that. But there is also an aspect, in a sense, an aspect of carrot as well as stick about this. And I say this as a former entrepreneur myself, because there's nothing like a clear limit for actually unleashing real change and real creativity and innovation. Without that limit, people don't quite know where to go, and that will be why those corporate networks are starting to say, look, give us the guidelines. You know, where are the edges? And then we can actually start moving in a different direction. And I think it's absolutely right that the faith communities, I mean, it's funny, we've actually been criticized on one or two occasions in the past about bringing in an element, or sort of speaking to an element of the morality and the sacredness as well of the relationship with the earth. And, you know, saying that, we've had people saying, well, let's keep this rational, let's keep this scientific. You know, we know that that this is what's being destroyed and we need to do something about it. But it's almost like the scientific metrics of what's happening are simply another form of translation, because there's so many peoples in the world and faiths in the world who kind of already profoundly understand that there is that connection. They don't need to have the metrics to get it. It just needs to be, you know, clearly, you know, felt and experienced. So I think that really sort of spoke to me. And I think that the final thing I'll say in response to those comments is that I think the ocean is absolutely going to be key in this. The Pacific Ocean and the blue land of the planet, and the water. And one of the things we were hearing this morning is about the sacred nature of water, and how we, you know, all of us are largely water, and how we have to protect that and honor that. And so yeah, I think that for example, the deep sea mining developments that are kind of at their beginnings are kind of, you know, fill me with horror, actually, that we have the kind of somehow the hubris to I mean, for any of the destruction in a way, but it's almost like, yeah, I really related to that sense of the final frontier on the planet. So yeah, I mean, those are my first thoughts.
Okay, thank you. There are so many threads to pick up in this. I don't know where to start, but yes, I just want to say that in our manifesto that we started to write, we said we are deeply concerned about the ongoing destruction of our home, the Earth, and you reflected that already. Demand a global response to prevent mass damage and destruction of ecosystem, ecocide. Supporting creating legal protection for life on Earth by including ecocide as a crime against peace under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So, as you say, this is an easy thing. It's a no-brainer to stand behind it. I mean, just tell stories. I can tell you that in my church, don't tell this to anybody, but in my church they said like this, well, this is problematic, we have to do some discussion about this, because the rights of nature is something that we should discuss. It's not so easy. And then I say, it doesn't have to do with rights of nature. You can actually, this is a thing that you can stand by without doing a full-scale discussion on the nature, rights of nature. And then I talked to the Bishop Conference of Church of Sweden and said, it's as easy as you have put it. And they, just a week ago, they said in a statement that they stand behind, we need an ecocide law. So I think it's very much for people to actually understand this is the least we can do. But what I can hear sometimes, it says people say like, we cannot even protect human rights around the world. How can you ask for protecting the ecosystem? We are not protecting humans. So what is your answer to that question? I don't want to do it, so. Alexandra, will you start? Or will you?
Okay, let me give it a shot. The challenge with this kind of statement is because, I mean, for me that's a cop-out, because every day the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and some of its, its engagement in countries forming parts of basic law, yes, there are places where it is not observed. There are places where where it's trampled on. But every day, millions of lives are saved as a result of it. Every day, billions of people experience a little bit more dignity because of it. It's a safety net. It's the lowest line of defense, right? We are called from faith, from morality, etc., to live at a higher standard, but when that fails, when we get lazy or greedy or whatever, this is the line, right? That's what this is. Yes, we want to move to the rights of nature. Yes, we want, like we say from the Pacific, to live in harmony with creation and all that beautiful stuff. But if that's not going to be done, at the very least, this is there. This is the line that we do not cross. And I think that's why it's very important. Thank you.
Thanks. And to add on to that, I think if we just go back to what is human rights, and when you go back to the type of human rights, especially, I mean, all human rights, but economic, social, and cultural rights, the right to food, right to water, I mean, just these basic rights, you actually realize it's the basis for it is the ecosystem. So then actually there cannot be, we cannot just protect human rights in abstraction either, outside of the ecosystem. So I think it's to that question, I would say it's important to maybe just sometimes get out of just the words and the principles and go back to what it means, really. And for that to be fulfilled, it's completely integrated. And you need to have some people who will continue really working on some legal systems for strong human rights protection. And then at the same time, we need to really continue developing this deep understanding that it completely relates on the ecosystems, and so we need to move forward in really protecting, not from an it starts from an external perspective, but then moving to, we are protecting ourselves as part of this ecosystem, or we're creating a narrative where we're creating change from understanding that we are in it.
Fletcher, you want to comment on that?
You and I have talked many times about our shared impatience with senior religious leadership and their unwillingness to get with the program quickly enough. I think what I would say is that the idea that we can't do what is clearly right because we're not perfect yet, I just don't know what to say. I think that the challenge is, from a Christian perspective, is to love. And that it's not like love, that's what all this sort of, whatever by 2030 or whatever by 2050. Jesus didn't say, love your neighbor as yourself 35 years from now. It's a fundamentally different kind of mindset. And so my feeling is, let's go. Let's do what and it's not like there's any serious debate about the planet being pushed way over the edge. That's, no serious person debates that. So I think that the challenge, and that this is, we're all here and, we're all trying to push our religious hierarchies to do more and to do it faster. That's our role. And I think what we need to say is this is, love.
Yeah, that's well said. Just to add to this, I haven't spoken so much. I'm just giving you the words, so that's an easy for me. But also when we did this work on the ecocide, Faith for Ecocide Law, I think that we saw the importance also to evaluate or to go back to our tradition to see what are the tools to actually act for this. And when you go back to them, and with this perspective, when we're living in Anthropocene, as we call it, so that in the traditions before, we may have all this kind of interconnectedness and sometimes called stewardship or caretakers or what we call them, So, but that has been in a situation when humanity don't have the impact of the full global system as we have now. And I think religions still live in a worldview where what we do doesn't matter too much to the planetary system. And now we are in a situation when what we are doing as humanity on this earth have a great impact on the full global system. But we still, in our faith communities, act like we're not having that. And for me, that has become even more important. The moral decision that we make as humanity now has not just an impact on other humans, it has an impact on the full global system and the future. So for me to act for an ecocide law is also to kind of bending the narrative, as you say, bending the understanding of going more through justice, and also the understanding of that we are having a great impact on the future. But we're still in a narrative where we see development like something that is based on, they say, values, but then when many people say values, they mean monetary values. And when religious people talking about values, we're talking about something like love and compassion and so on. And I think this is also something, because what you are challenging by saying we want an ecocide law is those who say, don't you want people to have prosperity? Don't you want the developed country to actually get a better life? Do you want to hinder them from this? I mean, you rich people in the north, you can have this ecocide law. We want to have food on the table, a good house, and a good life. And that comes with an economic, you have better economics that you get from the natural resources, and you want to hinder us from that. What is, any thoughts, response to that? Yeah.
Just very quickly, this is one of the issues that we're trying to grapple with in our region. And that is to shift the narrative from development as economic and measured by a GDP to actually looking at the well-being of people and places, the well-being of the environment, and reconnecting with this understanding that we are not above or separate from the ecosystem, that we are part of it. There are some, we can see some of those shifts already where we have, some companies, some groups are choosing to develop whatever they do to recognize that even if they build a hotel because of all the tourists and things like that, that resort, instead of looking at minimizing its environmental impact, is actually saying this will be part of the local ecosystem. How does it live as part of that? And that changing of mindset that is coming to that needs to happen. And so we need to be able to articulate that an ecocide law is not anti-development, right? It is not anti-development. It is just looking at things from a different perspective and setting boundaries. It is moving to what is truly sustainable development, not sustainable development that just says, okay, well, we're going to destroy this thing. How do we mitigate the, we're going to chop all the trees down. Now, how do we stop the landslides and the floods? Oh, we'll build some walls. It's changing the narrative. It's completely changing the narrative. And I think that's so important for us.
Jojo, you would say?
Yeah, I was just wanted to come in there about how the language is actually so important. And actually, I have a memory particularly of Polly, who I used to work with, Polly Higgins, and she, when we talked about sustainable, this word sustainable in itself is quite problematic. And she just, I remember when we first talked about it, she said, Jojo, if you told me that your marriage was sustainable, what do you think I would think about that relationship? You're kind of hanging on by your fingernails. That's not exactly a healthy relationship.
Happens to be all been there. Sorry.
So, the words we use do make a difference. It's almost like we're kind of, the public discourse is around getting to a place where we can just about hold on, whereas what Bhagwan's just been describing is actually where we should be moving towards, which is how do we become positive in our impact as opposed to negative in our impact. And I remember when I first read Bill McDonough's book, Cradle to Cradle, where he looks at the whole cycle of production and technical recycling and biological recycling. And there's this chapter in that book where he talks about, this is going to sound mad because he talks about a sofa, And this chapter had me in tears about a sofa, I mean, which is kind of insane, but it was because they'd worked with trying to find a company that could produce a piece of furniture, because furniture is notoriously difficult to recycle. It's obviously a combination of materials. And they'd managed to find a company that could use natural materials and chemicals that weren't damaging and all of these things. And also looking at the workplace and how it was like to work in that and for the well-being of the workers and everything. And the result was that they ended up with a factory where the water coming out of that factory was cleaner than when it went in. And I started to cry because I was like, my God, if this is possible, what on earth are we doing? Why aren't we all moving towards this approach? I mean, that's just one kind of Western example, but, I just found it actually, so inspiring realizing that, of course, human imagination and human intent is second only to Mother Nature in terms of the power of what we can actually manifest in the world. So all we have to do is decide that that's the way we're going. And this law, for me, is like that. It's like that empowering parameter that says, okay, well, we can't go that way anymore. So, right, where do we go? And one final thing about the language as well is that ecocide as a term is very powerful. The killing one's home, one's household, as Bergman was talking about. And there's also, I think, there's a way that it speaks to something that we can all perceive happening, which is, that nature is being destroyed in so many ways, and whether it's the marine ecosystems, whether it's the forests, whether it's the air pollution. And so having a word that brings all of that together is very powerful in itself. But then the fact that it's killing one's home, and it's the destruction, is that as soon as you understand it, there's this sort of intuitive reaction, well, that's wrong, that shouldn't be happening, that should stop. So it has a kind of internal momentum to it, and that's very powerful too.
Yeah. So one of my thoughts that I feel skeptics, maybe it's because this is really challenging some of our lifestyles, because I just read that, and Johan Rockström said in one of 10 insights the other day at the COP, he said that, and one of them was the just transition, when he said that the richest 1% had to lower their impact with about 30 times. And the 50% of the world's poorest can actually higher their emission to get wealth. So to have this understand, to stay inside 1.5. I mean, we often say we, and we have to, and we have to. And what is that we are talking about? It's such a different, not just global south, global north, inside countries. Coming from Sweden, I know there's a huge difference between the 10% richest of the country and the 10% with lowest wages. It's a huge, the impact is very different from those two. And going to a global level, it's as high as that. May this law on ecocide, is that threatening their sort of our lifestyle that is not negotiable? Is it about that, or am I totally out in the blue? Yes, Fletcher, help me out.
I mean, I'll bring the cranky dimension back in. I mean, I think that. To me, one of the things that's really important with this conversation is that it's my belief that we are not all equally responsible for the destruction of the planet. And I think it's really important to be clear about that. I think that there are a select number of major corporations, a number of governments that bear a hugely disproportionate responsibility for what's going on. And that may well just be my hopelessly judgmental Christian sort of self-speaking, but I don't think that any of us seated here bear nearly the level of responsibility. I mean, we all talk about common but differentiated responsibility in some sort of positive sense. It's equally true on the flip side. There are certain actors who are responsible for a massive amount of destruction of the planet. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, we had an action James was part of in a really powerful way, and others. So one of the organization, one of the companies we targeted was Total. We had a multi-faith action in front of Total's office. They trotted down their chief sustainability officer who came out and put on a good show and did a 90-minute dialogue about sustainability and said, if you hear about any human rights violations related to the East Africa crude oil pipeline, we want to hear about it. Exactly that same moment, we had actions going on in Uganda and Tanzania with tribal and religious people. They were doing a peaceful march, having gotten all the proper permits. The police came, pushed them forcibly off the road into the bushes and said, protest from the bushes. Tied up their legs so they couldn't walk for a couple of hours. 2 days later, so we put this, this got into a media release. 2 days later, the same guy from Total sees our lead activist from France at an event, walks over to him and says, you're really committed to humiliating us, aren't you? I mean, it's like, come on. Come on. And it was the same week that Total got outed for having known about climate change since the 1970s. Come on. We're not, there are certain actors, and I'm perfectly willing to look at that from a systemic and non-personal perspective. It doesn't need to be personal, but I think we need to be very clear that we should be careful about when we use we language around this. And be precise about that. And that's not at all to disregard the sort of 1% global north, global south, but I think then we should say global north or be specific about it. So I think the other piece is coming from the US, which is a bad actor on almost every imaginable level. This idea that you're going to get a worse quality of life when you sort of become less carbon intensive. I mean, God, I come to Europe, I'm happier, and it's, it's not that Europe's perfect, but it's a lot better than the US is. Good Lord. But what is this lack of imagination about what happiness is?
Alexandra, you want to react?
Yes, so from just a different perspective, I'm thinking it's just bringing me back to, so my work is mostly in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, and when I was looking at in the ecocide movement, the first states, some of the first states who really brought it as a side event to the General Assembly of the ICC were Vanuatu and the Maldives. And at the Human Rights Council, the Marshall Islands and several seats, small island developing states have just shown tremendous leadership in getting a new procedure, a special report on human rights and climate change recently. And so I guess just listening to what has been shared, my reflection is I would just say I'm inspired by that level of leadership and taking action in the system that we have from these perspectives, and ultimately really these states have also really triggered the change in many levels. So yes, I think that's just one point I wanted to add.
Polly, no, Polly. In the spirit of Polly, Jojo.
Yes, I think I'd like to respond to, or sort of perhaps echo in a way, what Fletcher was saying. I think the corporate PR machine has done a fantastic job, has done a job on society, has done a fantastic job over the last 20 years of making individuals feel, trying to sort of say, well, it's all of our fault. All of what's happening is all of our fault. You simply have the demand, we create the supply. You ask for, it's really not down to us. Well, that's kind of nonsense, isn't it? I happen to live in a rural area. I need to be able to take my children places. I have a car. I have a fossil fuel car because I can't afford, a car that is kinder on the environment, because those ones aren't subsidized. The fossil fuel companies still receive millions and millions in subsidies. So effectively, I'm not just a consumer, I'm a citizen, and I have options, and those options are given to me by government, and those decisions that are behind those options are often taken at the highest levels of industry and government, and so to be able to put in place something that can access that can have those people who are making those decisions sit and think very carefully before they, write a permit or make a decision about a big infrastructure project is really important. And it also has the potential to kind of start to rebalance that global north-south imbalance, because sometimes people say to us, well, the International Criminal Court is simply another colonial body. It's in Western Europe. The Pacific Islands wouldn't have actually had a voice at the International Criminal Court's Assembly if our organisation hadn't brought them there, because it's a long way to go and it's an expensive thing to do. And of course, with perhaps genocide and war crimes not so relevant, but when you bring ecocide into the mix, suddenly it becomes relevant. But of course, ecocide is different to those other international crimes in this particular way, which is that the ecocides are often happening in the global south and in the poorer countries, and the decisions that lead to them are taken in the wealthy north. And the ICC crimes aim at the highest person up the chain. And so there's something quite heartening about that potential to start rebalancing that sort of long-standing colonial inequality.
Thank you. Can we take questions from the audience? If there's anyone who have a question, feel free. I will come with the mic. Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much, all of you. It's a fascinating conversation. I'm Roz. I've put together an exhibition that Joe's kindly collaborated with. So the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is very important, the movement for a law against ecocide, as is the SGI, which I'm also proudly a member of. So just a couple of points I want to ask you to amplify on, really, which is that if there's a statement, I think there was a great point that it should be a shared statement with Indigenous peoples, but also who are we, who are the people most responsible. I think that there is an urgent case to make people aware of the role of the military in contributing to the climate crisis, and could not that statement from faith groups kind of help to do that and give that message, please?
Who want to respond to it? James?
Absolutely. I'll start with the military in my region. Since the end of World War II, and we've had the Gulf War and every other kind of thing going on in other parts of the world, but really no major conflicts in our region. I mean, if you don't include West Papua and others. But since the end of World War II, guess where all the nuclear bombs have been blown up? Right? More than, I think it's 183 kilotons of weapons. That's more than, I think, 1,000 or plus Hiroshimas since the end of World War II in our land, our blue land, our ocean. Is that not ecocide at a war crimes level? Yeah. In Mororoa and neighboring atolls in Maui, French Polynesia, in Enewatak and Bikini in the Marshall Islands, and became, so blasé about it that a type of swimming costume was named after it, the bikini. Right, people wear. In Christmas Island or Kirtimati, in what is now Kiribati, in the open sea, in Australia, on land. And so I see that as a war crime if we look at ecocide. And so I think militarization is a big issue. And then, of course, climate change, given the size of the carbon emissions from armed forces. I just wanted to place some context.
Yes, I come running or walking.
Yeah, thank you very much for mentioning this. My name is Günther. I'm coming from the northern part of Germany, living close to a nuclear waste site, and we are working against this industry for about 4 decades now, and also in connection with uranium mining, all the stuff that's happening all over the world, and we are extremely worried about the situation that's happening now in connection with a nuclear industry that's trying to put themselves into the situation as being a solution to climate change. And this COP, we have a real serious problem going on because the UK secretaries, they gave a very wide red carpet to this industry. They had more than 100 badges. We had 2. They have their own pavilion at the Blue Zone, and the International Atomic Energy, they had a wide possibilities to speak. The General Secretary last Wednesday, we had a press conference. It was the only chance for our voice to be heard on Saturday evening, which you can see on our website and also on YouTube. And this is something we are really worried about because it's always connected to the bomb, and there's no civil use of nuclear power. This is our opinion on that. Thank you.
Anyone who want to comment on that?
I would like to say a few words around nuclear because it's actually relevant in the history of why this crime is not already in existence. And when Polly Higgins first started investigating, I mean, her question was, how do we create a legal duty of care for the earth? And she ended up considering criminal law, particularly because of its protective nature. And when she went to, when there was investigation done, Polly and a number of researchers looked into this, looking into the drafting of the Rome Statute, which is the governing document of the ICC. And during the 1990s, there was actually a clause in that draft, the draft code of conduct that was going to end up as the Rome Statute, and it was clause 26, and it covered serious environmental crime as a sort of standalone, if you like. And that clause never made it into the final document. Now, it's worth actually just pausing for a second and imagining perhaps what a different world we might be in now if that had gone through 20 years ago. But when that research was done, it was found that there was no point at which a vote was taken on that, but there were certain meetings where certain countries had comments to make. And interestingly, those were the US, the UK, the Netherlands, France, and at one point Brazil. Interestingly, all oil states, and also interestingly at that time also investigating the development of nuclear. And now, of course, it's certainly virtually impossible to imagine a nuclear weapon that isn't ecocidal. So that's one aspect. But also, I think it's worth looking at, for example, how, people have sometimes asked, if this law is put in place, will that immediately outlaw the use of nuclear power, for example, as a power generation? I mean, the answer is, per se, no, it wouldn't instantly do that. But what it would do is create an environment where, for example, something like Fukushima could potentially be avoided because there were design aspects and safety aspects that were known about that weren't put in place, and if they had been, that tsunami would not have destroyed that plant in that way. And so, if the person making that decision had known that that knowledge was there and they were ignoring it and it was therefore going to cause this disaster, there might have been some very different decisions taken. And I think that is true of a number of, huge scale industrial accidents. Deepwater Horizon is another example where we know that there were safety protocols that weren't properly followed. So it would make a very concrete difference to that. And I think it's also interesting that in the Rome Statute, the only reference to environmental damage is within the context of war crimes. And of course, most environmental damage happens in peacetime, or so-called peacetime. And so that's really the huge gap here, is that actually all of that destruction is going on as a daily practice rather than as something that is coming up in a war context. But it is also true that, I just read something the other day about the proportion that the US military, for example, contributes to climate change. And so, the freedom to continue using certain approaches, certain kinds of weapons. There is definitely connections in there. That if we all did like Costa Rica, and actually banned the military, then we'd probably have a very different situation environmentally as well. So that there is definitely a strong aspect of that at play here. Thank you.
Just very quick on Fukushima. So they announced, the Japanese government announced this year, was it this year or last year? No, earlier this year, if not late last year, earlier this year, that in 2 years they're going to dump the waste from Fukushima in our Pacific Ocean. And, it's been condemned by the Pacific Islands Forum and countries and faith communities and civil society, but if we get a move on this law, maybe we can stop them. I mean, that's something that I know that this is why it's important. That some people can't just say, we don't want to dump it in our place, we'll just stick it over there. And so, it just underscores not just the need, but the urgent need for an ecocide law, an urgent need. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, we got some minutes left. 10 minutes left. So maybe we should try to wrap up from each one of us to see what we take with us from this and where we want to go from here. I can start, see if I can do something. I think that being from the faith communities and working interfaith, I see that this is something that we clearly should push together. And I see this is from a moral obligation to act. And laws are there to protect the most vulnerable, at least as I understand it. We need those laws that and that is a moral obligation for us, from my tradition, to act for the most vulnerable, to protect them, and to also we need to listen from the margins that what we hear. And as you see, this ecocide law, as you said, the ecocide that we see mainly happening in global south, but it's done by global north. So I think that is an important part for us to pick up on, to go further with it. I would love to see that more faith leaders will go to the different governments of the world, say you must push for an ecocide law. But because what happened, you see that law can actually take us to a better place when there are good laws to protect. Like, just a very simple example is that in EU you banned all the the normal light bulbs, and now we have those LED bulbs. And people will say this can never happen, it takes too much time, we can never do this, we can never meet this. But it took a law, and now it's there, and the energy saving is a lot just on light bulbs. So that's a law from the EU institutions. So if we have an ecocide law, we can also say, hey, you have to think twice before you do something very, very bad. And for corporations as well, this is kind of line. As you say, there are interest for them to have this kind of line to be there. So I'm going to go on pushing for this. I hope that Stockholm Plus 50 will actually put this high up on the agenda. It will be in May, June 2022. 50 years since the first UN meeting on environment, where actually ecocide was mentioned by the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme at that time. Then it was about the Vietnam War, but it was already mentioned there, so we haven't done so much since then. So, Alexandra.
Thank you. So, my takeaway, or first, thank you very much. It's a continuing learning process, and it's fascinating. And I think what I really liked most throughout the process is it seems unfeasible when you just don't understand it from the start. That was my feeling, was like, oh, that's too big. And the more I've really just gone into it, was like, oh, that's very feasible. That's very feasible, and as you said, not in too far a time. Many things are changing. The youth community worldwide is also pushing for more ambition, and that's inspiring, and for accountability. And I think my takeaway as well is that as interfaith community, we have to move on that. We have to move, and we have to move together to enable us to live what we preach, to enable us to live what we say, and the way we should live, really. So yeah, I think it's something very concrete that can become a tool that really echoes and reverberates as something ethical that contributes and go in sync with like deeper change, both at individual level, collective level, in our small communities, sparking conversations and then having concrete results, which I think will be really inspiring from the youth and young people community perspective. Also, we demand and they demand accountability, and I think there is something really powerful in that. And we are ready to hold ourselves accountable. So yeah, I take away a determination to work even more towards that.
I think Joe, you will have the last word, Jojo, because you're kind of host for us as well. James.
I think there's lots of spaces for this conversation to continue, but it needs to be ramped up. It needs to move into different places and spaces. I'm interested to see how we can bring this down to the Pacific, and so we can amplify it from the global south, not just from the global north. I think that's very important. I also think from the World Council of Churches, this is an urgent issue that needs to be raised. And that needs to be taken to next year's assembly. And so the different spaces in which we are and connecting need to have this message. Yes, there's lots of other things we have to talk about, but when all of them are connected with justice, this is one of those key issues. And this is a very practical thing that we can call for at a very simple level, as you said. And that's, for me, is the importance. It's simplicity in itself. It's not simplistic, but it's simple enough to say, you want to make a commitment to something? Support this. You know. And then once they support it, then we put everything else on top of it. But let's start with getting people on board. Thank you.
Fletcher.
So 2 years ago, the world, for the first time, faced an enormously dangerous pandemic. And there were responses to that were technological, biologically technological in nature in terms of the development of vaccines. But then once those were in place and once you'd gotten through the first wave of people who voluntarily wanted to get those, governments pretty quickly realized that the only way to protect the planet and to protect people was to just say, this is the law, period. We're serious about saving lives. And so because of that, this morning, I sat uncomfortably in the Glasgow train station, freezing, sticking something up my nose and rubbing it around because there was a requirement. Until there's a requirement to stop destroying the planet, we can't really claim that we're serious as a human family about doing it. I mean, it's just, I think it's that simple. And the benefit, this law is important both in its potential result, but also in its diagnostic capacity. And to say, look, it's either, this is either important or it's not. Imagine what it would be like if, all these people were going around saying, we would like voluntary measures to sort of, you decide when you want to get vaccinated or this or that. I mean, in the United States, there's too much of that already, and I can tell you what it does. It doesn't do good things. So just, to me, set the limit and watch how much good that does for people. And then be ready to work hard to enforce it. Because I'm not sanguine about how easy it is to enforce something like this. But that's the next struggle.
Jojo.
Yeah, I think the normative aspect is the first thing, isn't it, with the crime, is actually to have that sense that something that actually I think in the religious communities, that that whole kind of concept of what the moral taboo of the thou shalt nots. That's something that ecocide law can move towards. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to mention to close with. One is that religious leaders faith leaders are already at the forefront of this movement, from Pope Francis, who was actually the first head of state, effectively, to call for ecocide to become a crime back in November 2019, just before Vanuatu and the Maldives stood at the ICC. And very recently, the Orthodox Patriarch, also Bartholomew, also made a very clear statement that ecocide should become a crime as well. And I think this is, and of course, we have the indigenous leaders already talking about ecocide, particularly in the context of South America. And I find it a kind of interesting irony that it is the faith leaders of the world who are in the business of pointing out a reality, which is that we're deeply intertwined with the world around us and that we need to stop destroying it. That's just a factual reality. Whereas it's the secular, scientific, or the politicians and economists who supposedly are acting on facts, who are actually acting on faith. They're acting on faith in an economic model that simply cannot function in reality. You cannot continue extracting from a finite planet. It's just not possible. And so there's this crazy irony going on here, where it's the faith communities that have actually got a grip on the reality. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I agree with Fletcher that governments can act fast, and they've shown they can act fast with the COVID. So where perhaps, a decade ago, people used to respond saying, oh, well, that's going to take ages, and goodness, we'll have to work on this for years and years and years. And then a pandemic comes along and suddenly action's available really quite fast. So that's no longer an excuse. And finally, to echo what James Bagwan was saying, which is about the conversation. This is absolutely about extending this conversation into as many forums, as many different spaces and communities as possible. And there is no kind of more widespread and committed communities on the planet than the faith communities, and I think that's absolutely makes those communities fundamental to the growth of this conversation, which we know from our own analytics, where the conversations are happening, that's when the politicians start talking about it. So that's very encouraging, and thank you all.
Thank you so much. If anyone want to continue on this, there is a webinar later in November from Faith for Ecocide Law. You can Google it. And we will have from Jewish community, from Muslim community, from Hindu community, people speaking on Faith for Ecocide. So if you want to go further with this, you're welcome, and you can Google it up, I think, on the internet. So thank you so much.
Henrik, we should say a thank you to you, because within the sort of interfaith world, you've been the person who's, it's good that the Pope and the Patriarch have done their thing, which they should, but you've really, you're the one who's stirring the pot on this, and we owe you a debt of gratitude for that.
No. Can we stop now? Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Second time.